Why do governments regulate private markets? Why is there a need to regulate financial firms? Why banks? And what are the trade-offs involved with government intervention? These are the questions that we hope to address in this session. We will first consider regulation very broadly, and then we will get specific about bank regulation. We will describe what makes banks unique and how regulations have been designed specifically to address problems at banks. Let's start from a high level. Regulation is when the government intervenes in otherwise private or free markets. The regulation will apply some constraints to market participants. These constraints will influence decision-making and therefore market equilibrium. Why are we doing this? Well, the goal of intervention is to correct some market failure and to get us to a better outcome for society. Usually there is some negative externality or spillover that market participants ignore since it doesn't affect them. The government steps in and incentivizes market participants to account for this spillover in their decision-making. Environmental regulation is the classic example. Here we have a factory that pollutes. There is smog and chemical byproducts that run off into the river. People breathe in the pollution. If the fish in the river die off, then the fishing industry is negatively impacted. In this case, why do we need regulation? Well, the owner of the factory might not account for these downstream problems. The privately optimal amount of production, and therefore pollution, might be too large. The solution is environmental regulation. These regulations are designed to ensure that the factory owner accounts for the negative externalities from his production. We care about banks, so naturally we should be asking, what are the externalities that exist at banks? Let's address that question. Banks add value in society through the financial services that they offer. Savers and borrowers benefit in a number of ways that we've discussed in previous sessions. Generally speaking, regulators worry about bank failure. When individual banks or clusters of banks fail, then this can be very bad news. Bad news for local communities that need financial services. Businesses can lose access to credit. Bank failures can destroy household savings. If household savings are government insured, something we'll discuss in a moment, then bank failures can also be costly for taxpayers. Banks are highly interconnected. If one bank fails, then this could have knock-on effects for other banks. These are negative externalities. Shareholders and bank managers, they don't like failure. However, an individual bank is unlikely to account for these knock-on effects when they make their funding and their investment decisions. From a societal standpoint, risk-taking is excessive. This is the former headquarters of Lehman Brothers in Times Square, New York. Lehman is a clear example of how the risk-taking at one bank can spill over to other financial institutions and the broader economy. When an individual failure propagates throughout the financial system, this can lead to clusters of failures. These are sometimes called systemic failures. What causes systemic failures is an interesting question that we'll come to at another time. Regardless of the cause, in the event of its failure, Lehman does not bear any of the costs associated with systemic failures. These are negative externalities due to failure, and this creates a role for government intervention. There are two classes of financial regulation that exist to solve these externalities. Microprudential regulation aims to reduce the risk of an individual bank failure. For example, this can put limits on a bank's risk-taking. If the bank does not fail, then we're all fine. Macroprudential regulation instead aims to reduce systemic failures. These regulations target the pollution that spills over from our failing bank to other institutions. For example, if large failures are very costly to society, then we should impose stricter regulations on bigger banks. Preventing bank failures and promoting financial stability is not the whole picture. Regulators have other desired outcomes. The belief is that some of these outcomes would not be achieved absent government intervention. A major component of bank regulation is about customer protection. The government should protect small investors and borrowers. Small, uninformed depositors shouldn't lose their life savings if a bank fails. We, as a society, believe that is unfair. Borrowers, who are often less sophisticated than bankers, should not be ripped off when they use financial services. We have all worried about credit card fees or ATM charges at one time or another. Redlining is a notorious example of a socially undesirable behavior by banks. The background here is severe discrimination in US bank lending on the basis of income, gender, and race. This means no loans at all or lending on oppressive contract terms. Here is a map from a lender in Philadelphia circa 1937. This was called a residential security map. It classified entire neighborhoods as too risky. This sometimes led to the denial of credit for any resident in those neighborhoods. It has been shown that race was an important factor that determined whether a neighborhood was red or whether it was green. So you could be a great borrower just living on the wrong side of the red line and you would not be allowed to borrow. That's clearly unfair. To prevent this type of discrimination in lending, numerous government regulations have been put in place to ensure that banks serve all members of their communities. Having a safe and fair banking system sounds great, but there have to be trade-offs. After all, we do not regulate the risk-taking of auto manufacturers, even though we understand that there may be severe supply chain disruptions if one of them goes out of business. Let's be specific about the costs of bank regulation. Inefficiency. Regulations apply constraints to banks. These constraints can make banks less profitable. Trading generates profits. Banning trading lowers profits. Regulations nearly always have unintended consequences. When regulators encourage banks to grant mortgages in underserved communities, this might have the unintended effect of driving up rents. These neighborhoods might become unaffordable for some households. And then we have moral hazard. By not punishing excessive risk-taking with failure, the government creates a perverse incentive for banks to take on risk. Heads I win, tails you lose. Banks get the benefits when the economy is doing well, and then the government assumes the costs when the financial system collapses. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, is an example of a bank bailout. Some of the largest US banks had made bad investments. In 2008, these troubled assets were purchased by the government. These banks may have failed without government support, without taxpayer support. Many economists and commentators point out that these bailouts encourage risk-taking. Heads, the risky asset pays off. Tails, the risky asset goes to the government. Let's sum up. Negative externalities create a role for government intervention. Spillovers from bank failures create a role for bank regulation. These regulations can benefit society, but they do not come for free. Government intervention can make banks less efficient or bring about bad incentives. Whether regulation makes sense is ultimately a public policy question. Policymakers should weigh the benefits against the costs and make a decision.